Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 135. And just a little catch up on what's been going on in the last couple issues. We saw that after the giant flower monster named Thunder Petal was defeated by Tefe, Swamp Thing was looking around for Abby and he couldn't find her. And that's because she left with Chester, who moved to New Orleans, because she was so mad at Swamp Thing for making a doppelganger and tricking her basically into thinking that he was there. And Swamp Thing was able to track her down, where he was trying to explain himself and exactly what he was trying to do, but it ended up just making things worse. And they had a big fight, and Swamp Thing left Abby in Louisiana and went back to Terrebonne Parish. And while sitting outside of his destroyed house, we saw that he began crying because I think he finally realized that Abby might not be coming back. This might be the end of it for them. In the meantime, Abby is trying to get used to being single again. She is trying to find work in New Orleans. She tried a bunch of different places to get jobs at, but no one would hire her except a topless club that needed a waitress. So on her first night there, she was getting the hang of things, the costume she has to wear, all that stuff. And a man called out to her, and when she went to the tables to take their orders, she saw that it was in fact John Constantine. And that is where we left off. So first things first, with issue 135, we got the cover. We see a Swamp Thing that looks like he's been rooted. He has grown very large, his feet are embedded into the ground, and he's kind of in a fetal position. And it looks like there's a giant canopy of trees that have grown out of his back. And then below him, in front of him, because he is gigantic, we see a small version of Lady Jane holding Tefe, and Tefe is reaching out to him, but there is no movement on Swamp Thing's part. We see that this issue was written by Nancy Collins with art by Scott Eaton and Kim DeMulder. And we literally start off with the last panel of the last issue with John Constantine asking, "Hello, ducks. Does the hubby know you're working?" And then the next panel, Abby is just running away from that table and bumping into another waitress. And then she runs to the back area where all the women are getting dressed. And she hides behind the door and says, "Of all the titty bars on Bourbon Street, that weasel had to walk into this one? Can't I get one single lousy break? Is that too much to ask, huh?" And then I guess she's done for the night, or we cut to the end of the night where she's getting dressed out of her costume and putting on her regular clothes. And she's only just putting on her shirt, and she doesn't have any pants on. She's just in her underwear. And someone says behind her, "Miss, you forgot to take our drink order." And as she turns around, she sees John standing there with the man who was at the table with him. And John is saying, "My friend here would like a screaming monkey on the rocks, and I'd like a flaming boxcar, shaken, not stirred." And John's just kind of joking because he definitely did not expect to find Abby working at a strip club. So Abby quickly puts her pants on, and she goes up to him and puts her finger in his chest and says, "You can't come back here. This is the staff dressing room." And John says, "So I noticed." And then he looks to the side, and we see that there are lots of women changing and getting dressed, and they are naked and exposed to John, but none of them really seem to care. And I'm not sure if this is because John has done some kind of magic, or if the girls are just desensitized to someone walking in their dressing room. So John looks back at Abby and he says, "What are you doing here in the first place? Last time I saw you, you and the bog god were busy playing house and changing nappies. You and the cabbage haven't called it quits now, have you?" And at the mention of Swamp Thing, Abby kind of bites her lip and looks down like she's about to cry. And John exclaims, "Bloody hell, you have, haven't you?" And as Abby grabs her purse to leave and walk past them, she says, "What Alec and I are or aren't doing is no business of yours. So why don't you just get out of my way and leave me alone?" And then as she's walking through the club to leave, we see the general manager, I guess, or maybe the owner, run after her with her costume. And he's saying, "Hey, come back here, you. Where the hell do you think you're going?" And then he catches up to her and grabs her arm and says, "You spilled a drink on this thing. It's ruined. You owe me $75, girlie." And Abby snaps back, "75? How do you expect me to pay for $75? This is my first night on the job. I haven't even been paid by you yet." And the owner replies, "That's your problem, Toots, not mine." But then a hand comes out of nowhere and it's got a bunch of money and it's waving in front of the owner's face. And the person holding the money says, "I trust this should take care of matters." And the owner is kind of stunned for a second, but he does take the money and he walks away. And we see that the man who gave the money is the man who is here with John Constantine, who hasn't spoken yet. So he has come to Abby's rescue, and she walks up to him and says, "Thanks for helping me out, Mr." And the man introduces himself saying, "Reynard, Donatine Alphonse Reynard, but call me Don, please." And she smiles at him and says, "Thanks, Don." And from the way that she is drawn here, it kind of looks like possibly she is attracted to him. And I'll describe him right now too. He's got long blonde hair and a ponytail, and he's got a large trench coat on, much like John wears, except he's a lot taller and a bit more broad shouldered than John looks. And underneath that green trench coat, he has a black suit on, so he definitely looks very dapper. Then we cut to Terrebonne Parish in the swamp, where Swamp Thing is sitting on a fallen tree, and in his sadness, he has rooted into the ground. So we see his body doesn't look pretty much like anything he used to. All of his limbs have begun to sprout and grow. His hair has begun to grow, and his hands and feet have sprouted roots that are going into the soil. Even like the spikes and stuff that were on his new body, they have kind of dulled and grown out even more, but now they just kind of look like branches instead of spikes. We see Tefe and Lady Jane are looking at him, and Tefe says, "Is Daddy okay?" And Lady Jane replies, "I'm afraid not, dear." And we see the name of this issue is called Marital Problems. Then we cut to the Sunderland Corporation in Washington, D.C., and we see Connie Sunderland in her office, and she's on the phone, and she's saying, "What do you mean she's on her way to see me up? Smithers, I thought I told you there were to be no visitors. I don't care if she is my mother. I can't allow leaks to jeopardize what we've accomplished here." But she's cut off by someone saying off panel, "There she is. There's my little girl." And we see Connie Sunderland's mom come into the room, and she looks a lot different than Connie, who's always in business suits. She looks like a very tan woman who's got a very large hat. She's got a very billowy, bright lime green shirt. And it's the kind of shirt that you pull down below your shoulders. So she's revealing her shoulders, her neck, and the top of her chest. And there's a bunch of frilly stuff on the top of this shirt as well. And then she's got bright purple pants, which lime green shirt and bright purple pants definitely has a look, and they are pinstriped with black vertical stripes going down them. And she is also wearing matching purple boots. So it definitely looks like they're very different people just by the way they dress. And the mother continues, "Come here, sweetie, and give mommy a big hug." But it seems that Connie doesn't go to her, the mother goes to Connie. And as she hugs her daughter, Connie says, "Hello, mother. What a surprise." And the mom says, "Well, since I was on my way to visit your Aunt June in Jersey, I thought I might as well stop by and see how you were getting along. I'm not interrupting anything, am I?" And Connie answers back, "Well, to tell you the truth, yes, you are." And then the mom begins to look around the office and she says, "This was your father's office. Funny, it hasn't changed much since I used to work here in the secretarial pool. The drapes are different, so's the rug, and it looks like they've changed the paneling from oak to walnut, but it's essentially the same office." And then she looks up above Connie's desk and she sees the painting of General Sunderland sitting there very austere above them. And the mom says, "Except, of course, your father's no longer around to sit behind the desk." And then behind her a voice says, "I wouldn't be so sure of that, my dear." And the mom turns around and with wide eyes, she says, "It can't be Carlton." And we see standing behind her is General Sunderland, who I guess his first name is Carlton. I never knew that until just now. We see General Sunderland is in a suit and he's walking around on his own 2 feet, but he has a cane in each hand to help him walk. So it seems like still after waking up, he's a bit wobbly and is having trouble walking. And as he looks at the mom, he says, "Hello, Bubbles. Did you miss me?" And as she just kind of stares in disbelief, he says, "Constance, help your mother sit down. I'm afraid she's had quite a shock." And then the mom sits down and General Sunderland goes over to the bar and begins pouring her a drink, and he says, "Here you go, my dear. Drink this. It'll help." And as the mom watches him, she says, "My God, Connie, what have you done?" And then Connie walks over to her father, and he kind of gets really close to her from behind and starts caressing her face. And he's drawn super creepily here with his eyes don't even have pupils. They're just kind of white. And his skin is like a really weird shade of gray. And as he caresses his daughter's face in front of the mom, he says, "Done? Why, she's given you back your loving husband, my sweet. After so many long, cold, lonely years, we're once more a family. Isn't that right, my lamb?" And Connie replies, "Yes, Daddy." And then the phone begins to ring, and Connie says, "Excuse me while I get the phone." And then as she picks it up, she answers, "Yes, what is it?" And we don't hear the other side of the conversation, only Connie's, as she says, "What? Can't you handle it? Very well. I'll be down in just a second." And then Connie walks back to Sunderland, and she gives him a kiss on the cheek, and she says, "There's been a screw-up concerning one of our covert Central American projects that needs my attention. I'll be back in a couple of minutes." And then she goes over to her mom and gives her a kiss on the cheek, and the mom at this moment has not taken her eyes off of the dad. Like, while Connie's kissing her, she just leans towards Connie, but her eyes are wide and they're staring at General Sunderland. And as Connie kisses her on the cheek, she says, "I know you two have a lot of catching up to do." And then Connie walks out of the room and shuts the door. And the second the door closes, Bubbles says, "Who the hell are you?" And General Sunderland kind of gives a really creepy smile. He's got some underlighting, so he looks like the Crypt Keeper or something here. And he says, "Why, I'm your husband, Bubbles. I realize you've had something of a rough surprise, but don't you recognize me?" And just in case you forgot, he is not General Sunderland. This is actually Anton Arcane, Abby's uncle, who has possessed the dead body of General Sunderland. And the mom does not like being gaslit. She says, "I don't know who you are, buddy, but you sure as shit aren't Carlton Sunderland. Loving husband my ass. Carlton couldn't stand the sight of me. Hell, the only reason we even married was because I threatened to file a sexual harassment suit after he knocked me up." And then she walks over to Sunderland and puts her finger in his chest and says, "And as for Connie, the old fart couldn't have cared less about her after the doctor told him I delivered a girl. You might be able to fool her into thinking you're her father, but I know better. I don't know how you managed to pull this scam off, but I'm not going to stand by and watch you get away with it. Carlton Sunderland is dead, and I'm keeping him that way." And then she walks out of the room and slams the door, and then we get a really creepy panel of Sunderland staring at the door, and we get a ghostly figure of Anton Arcane behind him in like some mist. So that's just the artist's representation to show the reader that this is in fact Anton Arcane. And as the door slams, General Sunderland responds to her threat saying, "We'll just see about that." Then we cut to somewhere on the Washington Beltway, which is a freeway, and we see a large purple limousine driving, and inside that purple limousine is, of course, Bubbles Sunderland, and she's in the back seat pouring herself a drink, and she's saying, "The gall of that man, trying to pass himself off as Carlton. Well, he might have Connie hoodwinked, but if he thinks he can pull the wool over my eyes, he's got another thing coming." And then she picks up the car phone and begins to dial, and as she does this, she continues saying, "I'm going to nip this scam right in the bud before it has a chance to grow any further." And then someone on the other end of the phone picks up, and Bubbles answers, "Hello? Operator, I'd like to place a call to my daughter's private line." And as she's saying this, we notice something interesting in the panel. On the window next to her, there is a big fly. But Bubbles doesn't notice it, and she just continues saying, "The number is..." But she's cut off as all of a sudden, a bunch of flies break through the window and begin pouring into the back of the limousine, and she exclaims, "What in hell's name? Jacques, what's going on?" But Jacques can't answer because the flies actually engulf him, and then we see the steering wheel turn and directs the limousine into oncoming traffic where a semi-truck is heading straight at them. And as Bubbles yells out, "Jacques!" we see the limousine collides with the semi-truck head-on at full speed, and it definitely doesn't look like anything's going to survive that wreck. Then we cut to the Sunderland boardroom where Connie is yelling at the board members, and she's saying, "And further incompetence on your behalf, gentlemen, will result in dismissal. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" And all the board members respond the same, saying, "Yes, ma'am, yes." Then a secretary comes up from behind Connie and hands her a piece of paper, and Connie reads it, and then she gets pretty silent, and she says to the board members, "If there's nothing else to discuss, I really must leave. I've just received news of a rather pressing matter. Good day, gentlemen." And then we cut to her in her office, and she's just looking at the note thoughtfully, and then she begins to cry, and she says, "Mama?" And as she's crying, we hear a voice from behind her say, "Constance." Then we see it's General Sunderland, and he's standing there, and he's saying, "I just heard the news." And Connie runs over to him and hugs him, and she says, "Oh, Daddy." And Sunderland hugs her back, and he says, "I know it seems so terribly unfair to lose one parent just as you reclaim another, "Don't worry, baby. Daddy's home." And as he says this last line, he gives a really creepy smile because as he's hugging her, she can't see his face. And as he gives that creepy smile, his face kind of shadows and then half of it turns into Demon Anton Arcane's face. Then we get to New Orleans, Louisiana, and we see Abby is talking in Chester's apartment and she's saying, "Honestly, Chester, I don't know what to do next." And as we cut into the apartment, we see her and Chester are sitting in the living room and she's on the couch reading the newspaper, looking through the classifieds again. And she continues saying, "I lost my job in under 8 hours. That has to be a world's record." And Chester replies, "It was a shitty job." And Abby says, "Well, right now, shitty isn't such a bad word. Man, I knew the economy was bad, but I didn't realize it was as bad as everyone was saying. No wonder people were taking that Swamp Thing for governor joke seriously." And then she's cut off by a knock at the door. So she goes to answer it, and when she opens, she sees the person knocking was in fact Don, the gentleman from the club who was there with John Constantine. So as she answers the door, he looks at her and he says, hi. And I don't know if he says it like that because he's kind of like taken aback by her beauty or something. But Abby answers him saying, "Oh, hi, it's Don, isn't it?" And Don replies, I hope you don't mind me taking the liberty of looking you up. It's just that that is." And the whole time he's been standing there, he had his arms behind his back. And that's because he was hiding a dozen roses back there. And so he holds them out to Abby and he says, "Oh, hell, say it with flowers, stupid." And we see she gets a little smirk on her face as he holds the flowers out to her. Then we cut to 2 hours later and they are at dinner. And they're at a square table and she's not sitting across the table from him. She's actually in the seat right next to him. So it seems like they've gotten pretty close over this dinner. And she's saying, "You seem like such a nice man, Don. How did you get to know someone like John Constantine?" And Don replies, "It's a long, sordid story. Let's just say that I collect occult objects to art, and that John is one of my more esoteric sources. What about you? How did you meet him?" And as we turn the page, we get a flashback to Swamp Thing fighting the Involche in Brazil, which is all from the Alan Moore run. So if you missed that, definitely go check out those episodes. I think it's around issues 45 to 50. So as Abby has this flash in her mind, she says to him, "That's a long story too, and not one I'm ready to go into right now. I guess you could say he's a business associate of my husband." And then Don asks, "Does your husband live here in New Orleans?" And Abby replies, "No, he's in Huma." And Don apparently likes the sound of that because he says, "Abby, I just want you to know I think you're one of the most stunningly beautiful women I've ever had the pleasure to meet face to face. And having said that, I want to know how you'd feel about working for me." And Abby's taken aback and she says, "What?" And Don kind of sees her reaction and he kind of tries to cover as if he wasn't hitting on her. And he says, I feel really bad about John and I losing you your job at the club. Not that I'm offering you a job for ulterior reasons. Well, kind of." And then he reaches in his coat jacket and he pulls out a business card and he hands it to Abby and he says, "I need someone to help me catalog my acquisitions, and you seem to be both bright and genuinely honest, and I better shut up while I'm ahead." And then he stands up and he says, "Promise me you'll give it some thought." And she looks up at him and smiles and says, "I promise, Don. Thanks." Then she looks at the card, and I gotta say, this is not a business card. It is just his name, his address, and then his phone number. So it's literally just like, here are my digits. There's nothing on the card that says this is for my business. So he leaves, and then she looks at the card, and she kind of thinks about it for a second and smiles and says, Then we get back to Washington, D.C., and the Sunderland headquarters, and General Sunderland is talking to Dr. Polygon, and he's saying, "I'm so glad you could find the time to come here tonight, my good doctor." And Dr. Polygon replies, "Nonsense, General. The honor's all mine. I was wondering, now that I've done what I was hired for, what are my chances of remaining with the company?" And we see as they're walking, they're going into the genetics lab. And Sunderland is walking around looking at the different experiments, I guess, that they're doing. And one of them looks like a family of Sasquatches or something, but I think it's probably just humans they're experimenting on that are making them look like that. So Sunderland looks at the Squatch family. He says, "You needn't worry about your position, my good doctor. Connie and I both think you would make an excellent permanent addition to the Sunderland team." And Dr. Polygon is joyed to hear this, and he says, "Really? Does this mean I'll be receiving a research grant to continue my work on metaphysical ergonomics? And then suddenly, Sunderland turns around and he has a syringe in his hand with something in it, and he injects the leg of Dr. Polygon and he says, "Not exactly." And then Polygon falls to the ground and says, what did you do? And then we get a really creepy panel that's a POV shot from Dr. Polygon as he's raising his hands to try to block Sunderland, who is about to inject him again with something. And you can see the world behind him is getting all wonky, like the ceiling grid is becoming like spaghetti noodles. And Sunderland is saying to him, "Relax, my friend. I'm only trying to help you realize a more perfect you." And as we turn the page, we see we are still in Dr. Polygon's point of view. So we see like tubing and medical equipment and IVs. And then those move out of the way and we see General Sunderland come into view and he says, "Don't worry." And then we see his hand come up in the next panel and he's got a scalpel and he's getting closer to Dr. Polygon's face and he says, "This won't hurt a bit." And then seemingly without any anesthesia or anything, Sunderland begins to cut into the abdomen of Dr. Polygon, and Dr. Polygon is tied down to the bed. His face is completely covered except for his eyes, and all he can do is scream out, as General Sunderland hacks away at him. Then we get to New Orleans that night, and we see John, Constantine, and his buddy Don are hanging out in Flannery O'Connor's Irish pub. We see Don is asking John, saying, "So, John, about this Abby?" And John replies, "Yeah, what about her?" And Don asks, "How long have you known her?" And John answers, "I guess I've known Abby as long as I've known her hubby. Several years now." Then Don asks another question. "What's he like? Her husband, that is. Does he, mistreat her?" And John exclaims, "God, no. He worships the bloody ground she walks on, far as I can tell. He's an okay bloke, I guess. Bit of a stick up his arse if you get my drift, though." Then Don asks, "I was wondering, not that it's any of my business, mind you, I was wondering if you'd ever, and John cuts him off to answer saying, "Bonked her? Not really." Then Don asks, "What do you mean by not really?" Then John cracks a big smile and says, "Let's just say I wasn't myself at the time." And that, of course, is a reference to the Rick Veitch run where Swamp Thing took over John's body so that he could impregnate Abby so they could have Tefe. Then we cut to the swamp and we see Lady Jane is reading a book to Tefe. And they're in the house that was previously destroyed by Thunder Pedal, so I'm assuming Lady Jane has grown back at least part of the house so that Tefe and her will have a place to sleep that night. So as Lady Jane finishes the story she's reading to Tefe, we see Tefe is fast asleep in her arms, so Lady Jane brings her up the stairs and into her room, and she tucks Tefe in and then gives her a kiss on the cheek, and then she goes to the balcony and looks out at Swamp Thing, who's still just rooted sitting there on the log. And it seems like she's debating something in her mind, like should she do something? And as we turn the page, it seems she's made up her mind because we see her walking down to Swamp Thing and she kind of walks all around him. And then she holds out her hand and she touches his shoulder and her fingers begin to turn into roots and they begin to dig into Swamp Thing's body. Then we cut to inside the green, or at least inside of Swamp Thing's body, and her avatar appears there. And in the green, she looks a little bit different. She's not wearing a dress, she's naked, and her skin is still like orange, but it definitely looks like it's human skin now. And she calls out in the green, "Prime Founder, where are you? I know you're here within the green. Please answer me." And then we see a bushel of leaves next to her say, "Lady Jane, why have you followed me here?" And she replies, "Your daughter and I are concerned about you. It grieves us to see you in such pain." And as she's talking, Swamp Thing is beginning to grow his body from a bushel of leaves into the normal version of him that we've seen throughout the rest of this comic before he had his change. And he replies to her saying, "Abby no longer wishes to be my wife. I do not know what to do. The green is a comforting place where I can lose myself, where I can forget that I was ever a husband, a lover." And Lady Jane cuts in saying, "A father. Would you forget Tefe as well?" And Swamp Thing replies, "No, of course not." Then Lady Jane's eyes get all sultry and she looks at Swamp Thing and she says, "Prime Founder, the green is a fine and private place, but I fear none do here embrace." Then she grabs Swamp Thing's hands and then they begin to hug and intertwine with each other. And that is where the issue ends. And I don't know about you, but the second they introduced Lady Jane, I knew this was going to happen, and I'm not happy about it. But we'll have to see what happens in the next issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.